Today I'm talking about William Henry Fox Talbot. I first did this part one of this talk at Lacock for the Photographic Collectors Club last year, and it was then I realised that you couldn't do a talk on Fox Talbot in one session, and now having prepared for the second session I realise it's quite difficult to do it in two sessions because it's just so much to the life and times of William Henry Fox Talbot. But this talk basically goes from 1839. I'm lucky in that I was born in the town of Trowbridge, which isn't the greatest of towns, but it's based in Wiltshire and it's only 7 miles from Lacock. Or 7 or 9. And as a child, I remember going quite often to Lacock. There I am at the age of 6 months. And many of you will recognise that building as being the barn at Lacock. And the barn is now home to the Fox Talbot Museum. In the 1960s, Lacock was a very different place. The house was only open on high days and special days. And as you can see there, the barn is still acting as a barn. But as a child growing up and going on the out to Lacock sometimes, it was an incredibly pretty village, and I knew the story of Fox Talbot. I knew that this pioneer of photography came from this charming little village. And there was a number of really good documentaries in the 1970s about photography. And as a child, I was fascinated by photography. And again, seeing these documentaries about this pioneer of photography, I found to be absolutely fascinating. When later I joined the club, I was lucky to hear some excellent Fox Talbot talks, and I remember hearing Roger Watson talk about the whole de guerre Fox Talbot debate and saga. And I realised it wasn't straightforward. Fox Talbot is not straightforward. The story is not straightforward. So one of the real reasons I wanted to do the whole process of doing a talk was, from a slightly selfish point of view, finding out more about Fox Talbot and some of these issues. This is Morton House, and I've included Morton House here as he was born in Dorset, was Fox Talbot. His mother was a Stranraise, and the Stranraise are an aristocratic family who are still landowners, one of the largest landowners in the UK. So from his mother's family there was some wealth. His father, Davenport Talbot, could be described by some people as a bit of a cad, and he died when Fox Talbot was very young, and so Fox Talbot was brought up very much by his mother's family, and he spent some time living with his aunt, and this is Morton House, where Talbot and his mother and his aunt and his uncle lived for some time. Why I've got Morton House in here is I now live in Dorchester in Dorset, and Morton House is only 7 miles away. So wherever I've moved to, there seems to be a Fox Talbot connection somewhere. And here we have the Abbey. 1836, 1835, 1836, we've got the lattice window, which we'll just look at shortly. But by 1839, Talbot is very much established at Lacock. He had inherited it from his father, and it was to become his laboratory, his studio. It was a very important place to him. And here we have the lattice window, and the key question that a lot of people sometimes ask is, Talbot did these experiments, he did these photographic drawings in the years 1835 to 39, but why did he not patent? Why did he basically sit on these papers and sit on these thoughts? Because as you probably know, the point in one sense was 1839 on the 22nd of January, when the Frenchman Louis Daguerre announced to the world this photographic process, the daguerreotype. Talbot is quite shocked by this announcement because he's obviously been doing his experiments. He sees himself as one of the founders of, well, as the inventor of photography. So he rushes from London down to Lacock, and he gets out his papers, and by the end of January he is actually talking to the Royal Society. But there's lots of issues. Why has he not published before? I think one of the key factors is that the photogenic drawing process was not fully explored. He had issues with the photogenic drawings. The photographs were very small. The lattice window, I believe, is just bigger than a postage stamp. They often faded. The images which were done like photograms, they worked very well, but they were issues, and he knew he would come back to that. And I think he had the confidence himself that he was going to explore the whole photogenic drawings further and get to a state where he would get to some form of what we would now recognize as a photograph. It is possible as well that he was aware of other scientists and didn't want other people taking his work, so he was very much keeping things to himself. But we know that his mother was very keen to tell other people of his work, and actually maybe gave some of his work away. So, but 1839, he's obviously, with the announcement of Daguerre, he is writing to the Royal Institute to ask to speak to a members' meeting on the 25th, which he does, and he publishes this paper on photographic drawings in the February of 39. Now, a key point of 1839 is that it is the year he really starts to take his photogenic drawings further. He has looked at gallic acid before. He had bought some back in 1834, but he buys some again in the March. Why this is important is in the September he makes the dramatic discovery that by using a weak solution he produces what we now call the latent image, that he can expose an image. With the photogenic drawing, it's very much based on the printing out process. By doing the using this weak solution, he finds he exposes the image, leaves it overnight, comes back, and only when he adds a solution to it, the image appears. So he realizes he's got the latent image, which is the foundation of the photography as we know it. So this is a key point, and the image is stronger, and he is basically develops this whole process which he calls the calotype. Being a good Greek scholar, colour meaning beauty, a beautiful image. His mother, again, who was very good at promoting her son, thought he should call it the telescope. But he decided on the calotype. I think it's really interesting to look at Talbot as he is the first, in many senses, the first photographer, and when he's looking at things, he hasn't got the whole background of hierarchy and background of images we have today. We see millions and millions of images. Again, he has got some arts background, he's got some art appreciation, so he does understand the fundamentals of composition. Yet I think it's really important to put things in context and to think of him as seeing things for the first time in the photographic form. The the calotype doesn't actually lend itself easily to portraiture. It needs a long exposure. Because it's paper on paper, you get a sort of slightly mottled effect. Talbot did refine this by waxing the paper and making it almost translucent, but still it's not an easy process for portraiture because the exposure time required is quite long. And yet when we see Fox Talbot doing portraiture, I think the results are fascinating. And this portrait we see here, it's a man unknown with books, but the lighting is carefully considered, the props are really considered there, the composition really works. This is a successful image, I think. The pose is probably based partly to keep the person still, but we have a real sense of a person there, and the composition is strong. It's a strong image. Daguerre's process had been taken on by the press and was acclaimed by the public, partly because the results were so crisp. Fox Talbot realised commercial success, he felt, was very much based on being able to use his process for portraits as well, and he realised it wasn't so tuned to portraits, but he realised the portrait market was important. Daguerre's process is bought by the French government. Talbot's process is patent, and Talbot takes out a number of patents. And one of the issues that becomes with Talbot is the whole controlling of the licenses. Richard Beard has the license for daguerreotypes in London and is operating a very successful studio in Regent Street. Talbot was keen to get a studio or get photographers using his type, and he eventually persuaded Anton Claudette who was a daguerreotype photographer. He was a scientist and artist, and he persuaded Claude to take on the process. It wasn't particularly successful, but they remained good friends. The place where portraiture was successful was actually in Scotland, and ironically the license didn't cover Scotland, so photographers could use the process without payment. The payment of a license, I've got various figures from £20 up to £300 depending on the type of license. And there's also accounts of the license not only being difficult to purchase and expensive to purchase, but in dealing with Talbot, because Talbot was such a busy person and not always in one place, that it wasn't always immediate to get the license, so it could be quite complicated to get the license. So there was all sorts of issues with the license, and photographers were slightly frustrated that some people wanted to use the license but couldn't afford it or felt it was unfair. In Scotland, where the license wasn't valid, we get the most success for portraits, and the work of John Adamson and David Octavius Hill is amazing work and something that takes a talk in itself. But they are left to their own devices in a sense, and perhaps about what sort of happened to the calotype is that it needed to have people to take it on further. Fox Talbot perhaps he wasn't a good manager, perhaps he needed a PR agent. He saw himself, I think, as a scientist and a polymath. He wasn't necessarily an entrepreneur. He didn't need entrepreneurs to work for him, but maybe he had some issues in getting the right people. In order to get his work better known, he realised that publication could be an important part to play. And in about 1844, with the establishment of a photo works at Reading, which I'm going to talk about a little later on, he publishes this book called The Pencil of Nature. This little work, now presented to the public, is the first attempt to publish a series of plates or photograph pictures wholly executed by the new art of photogenic drawing, without any aid whatsoever from the artist's pencil. So what he was producing here is the first photographic book, and it's a book of plates. The font there was designed by Owen Jones, who was a great designer of the time. So Talbot has considered this very carefully. He's got a very contemporary look to the book there. He's got one of the great designers of the age working on that. And the photographs themselves, I think, are absolutely incredible, because we are looking at new uses. I mean, this is the new art, and what do you use it for? So he's photographing objects, he's talking about that, he's describing that. We see a collection of books there. I think Talbot is sometimes underrated as an artist. The composition works, the lighting works, everything is actually really well considered. And in the book as well, he talks about what types of objects could be photographed and why these objects could be photographed. And here they do exclude portraits, partly because portraits could be complex to take, and he could argue there might have been other issues there recording portraits. We do have this wonderful doorway here, which has a lot of references to the art of the past. It is definitely a still life. It's got fantastic composition, and again, it's an image I know we have discussed before, but I think it's a very important pictorial image, and is perhaps, in one sense of the word, the first art photograph, art in photography. Talbot is making that decision, what to photograph, how to photograph it, how to set the camera, how to set the broom, how far that door is open. He actually, even though he did it I don't know whether he considered it carefully or did it quickly. I suspect he did it quite carefully, and those are all decisions of a photographer, and that is the art of photography, the decision making of the photographer. Even a simple, well, the lighting of that bust, I think it was incredibly effective. Photogenic drawings lend a form of photograms, and again, these images are, we now very afraid with photograms, but this is very new and contemporary out of the time. And the whole Reading institution, establishment, well, it's an establishment. Reading is in between Wiltshire and London, and made a good base for Fox Talbot. And it's a it's a place where different activities are taking place. We can see a gentleman having his photograph. We can see another person working at copying a portrait, an art portrait. Plus, in this place, a lot of printing is going on, and the whole editions of the Pencil of Nature is being produced here, right? And Talbot does another book called Pictures from Scotland, based on Walter Scott's places. And again, I think that's got 24 plates in, and again, that is done here. And I think it's one of his intentions to eventually take Reading to London. He has a very good manager in Nicholas Henman, who again eventually opens a studio in Regent Street. In 1847, Reading closes. Talbot has put a lot of money in. There's very interesting accounts of a lot of the prints from Reading went back to Lacock. But in 1847, Henman is working in Regent Street. He's been appointed as Queen's photographer, and Talbot seems to have been quite generous to Henman, and in my understanding he actually gives him a loan, and eventually Henman buys out the business. And the early 1850s, it's a good time for Henman, and he's actually working, he's very productive. And again, just wanted to mention a bit about Talbot as a photographer. When Talbot goes somewhere, he takes his camera, and some of these images, again, I think are just beautiful. I think that of the pavilion is just wonderful. It's carefully composed. It has a lot going for it, I feel. Important, I think, to mention some of the constant is his wife, and again deserves several talks on her own, I think. That's an area I would like to know a little bit more about. She was definitely very important and probably the first photographic assistant. His mother was his great promoter. As I said, he came from this very wealthy family, but she was quite good at promoting her son. So he had good connections in society, and she used those first connections. And he died in 1846. Miss Fielding was his half sister, who he was very, very fond of as well, and she dies moderately young in 1851, and I think this could have had an effect on Fox Talbot as well. I've got no proof of that, but I just wonder if it did, because I'll just quickly look at a couple of his scientific images there. I think this is a incredible image here of a moth, ring of a moth, and dandelion seedlings there. But I wanted to get to the 1850s or the early 1850s, and the important thing is the patents. The patents are important to Fox Talbot. He is keen to control photography, or his intellectual rights. He's also patenting other inventions, motivative power in particular. But this control is not viewed universally, or is welcomed by all. And a band of progressing photographers at that time were critical that they felt that the control he was putting in was limiting the art of photography. They felt it was also limiting the progression of photography. And in 1854, the colour type patent was coming up, and the newly formed Photographic Society was quite concerned that this was going to be renewed, because they felt that they wrote to Talbot, who eventually came to a compromise and said, well, for gentlemen of scientific research, I will not have the patent controlling you. However, he was still very strongly to have the patent for portraiture. And this got to a head, basically, where at the same time there was a collodion process being developed by one of the heroes, I think, of photography, who again sometimes get neglected. And this little hero of photography was he had been a daguerreotype photographer, and it was Frederick. For a second, I'm going to pause. Frederick Scott Archer. And Frederick Scott Archer was a struggling daguerreotype photographer who realised that what you actually needed was a combination of daguerreotype and Fox Talbot image, because the Fox Talbot image could be reproduced, the daguerreotype could not be. So he thought, if I could get but the daguerreotype was sharp, it was crisp. So what I need is a crisp image that can be reproduced. And he went back to the thought of glass and collodion, which is like a gun cotton dissolved in alcohol. He realized that if he mixed this with silver, he could actually cover a piece of glass. The problem was it was effective when it was still damp, and this is how it becomes known as the ret collodion process. But it became very popular. Scott Archer didn't have any wealth behind him. He was struggling. He couldn't afford a patent. He didn't patent. And because he didn't patent the process, it was taken up by a lot of photographers, and it quickly in the 1850s became popular. Because of its use of silver nitrate, Talbot saw it as an affront on his patent, and so a writ was served on Sylvester Laroche, and this amalgamated itself in a 3-day court case. And it wasn't good for Talbot. In one sense, he was okay because the judge said at stake was whether he was the true inventor of photography, and this was upheld. But the judge also said that Sylvester Laroche had not been guilty of flouting the patent. And Talbot writes to his wife, neither the judge or jury understood anything of photography. They fell into awful mistakes, not being able to comprehend the process. And Talbot indicated at this point that he was going to take legal action further. There was another case pending as well. And it had taken a toll on Talbot, and eventually in 1854 he basically decided not to take the legal cases, and the other case was settled out of court, I believe, at some cost to Talbot, and he did decide not to actually renew the patent. And at that point the collodion process did become the process. But this has always dogged Talbot, that his defense of his patent had actually caused quite a lot of controversy. His health had suffered by this point, and remember, he's 54 at this stage, and the context of the Victorian time, I think he was suffering from bad health, and he begins to get more interested in some of his other interests. He spends more time at Lacock. He is incredibly interested in the Assyrian Empire, and he's working on the translation of tablets, which does actually become a very important work. By 1860 he has retired to Lacock, and he is fascinated by photo engraving. He continues to work on photo engraving. He produces patents. He produces important work on photo engraving. But basically his work on photography is done. It's interesting that he doesn't really carry on with any form of photography. His son becomes takes collodion photographs, but we have really no image taken by Talbot from about 1858. And by 1860 he has retired to Lacock, and he's considered to be slightly of a recluse, but he is known as a devoted grandfather. His son became interested in medieval church architecture. Talbot is very much, I think, a family man. He enjoys his family, and it's interesting, the contemporary accounts are of a devoted grandfather and a landowner who was very much appreciated by his workforce and his estate workers. And he dies in 1877. He is a character, I think, that changed the world, I consider, and if he hadn't been there, perhaps someone else would have taken photography on, but it was Talbot who actually did take that on, I think. And I think maybe some of the flaws in his character, well, perhaps they weren't flaws, but this determination. So you get this conflict, this sort of calm, gentle man but he is they determined about the patent. Now, I started the talk with the photograph of myself aged 6 months. What is fascinating and lovely about Lacock now is the care it receives from the National Trust. The museum, I think, is fantastic. One of my I've really enjoyed being able to take students to Lacock. The legacy of Fox Talbot is huge. Unfortunately, I think his name is sometimes internationally forgotten. I think even in this country, some people forget Fox Talbot. So I think one of the great things about the club is we can talk about Fox Talbot. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to this. This was a talk, as I said, I did for the Photographic Collectors Club. We were doing it on Zoom and I forgot to press record. So this is basically a replay of the talk. I'm afraid I haven't got the questions and answers we had from the talk. I've got a bibliography on the end of here. The books I've talked about are all fascinating. Roger Watson's account is really clear and it gives a wonderful context. Arnold's book is full of detailed facts, but again, this is really, I think, important and helps towards the understanding of Fox Talbot. So thank you for listening. I'm going to end it there. Thank you. Do look at the bibliography, it is here. Thank you.